he was crazy fighting his way through traffic and getting there. He just lost track. But it would have been easier for him, he would have come in earlier. But nevertheless, he did a perfect job.
Niki Lauda spent 5 decades in Formula One as a driver, a rival, a mentor, and a chairman. And across all 4 roles, he was famous for never softening an opinion to spare feelings. He raced one legend, was shaped by a teammate he called his equal, quietly built a third driver's entire career from the boardroom itself, and personally recruited a fourth, staking his own reputation on the decision. 5. Alain Prost. When Niki Lauda arrived at McLaren for the 1984 season, the team already had a fast, ambitious Frenchman in the other seat, and Lauda made no secret of how he felt about it. He has said plainly that he hated the idea when he first heard about Alain Prost joining him at McLaren, not out of any personal animosity toward the man, but because he understood immediately, from watching him at Renault, exactly how dangerous a threat had just been placed on the other side of his own garage.
But nevertheless, he did a job, unbelievable. The way he passed, impressive. But I mean, I knew the guy's good, but he proved it again to everybody what he can do.
It was, in Lauda's own blunt phrasing, the arrival of his biggest enemy as a teammate. What followed became one of the tightest and most respected rivalries of the era. The 2 men fought through the 1984 season, locked in the smallest championship margin Formula One had ever produced. Lauda edging Prost by half a point after a year of relentless, evenly matched competition. Rather than souring resentment the way so many intra-team rivalries did, the closeness of that fight seemed to deepen the respect between them. Lauda has described the period as one of the most rewarding of his career, not simply because of the results, but because of what it revealed about the driver he was up against. Lauda's regard for Prost centered on something specific: precision.
Safety car decision, which I didn't understand, was outstanding, incredible to watch.
Where Lauda approached the sport as a calculating engineer might, extracting the maximum from a car through relentless application and remorseless attention to setup, he recognized in Prost a kindred mind operating with the same clinical discipline, only faster. Lauda would later describe himself as the computer of the era's great trio: himself, Prost, and Senna, the driver who won through calculation rather than raw instinct, and he placed Prost in the rarest company by suggesting the Frenchman was the only other driver of that generation who approached a race weekend with the same obsessive attention to detail that Lauda himself brought to every session. Off the track, the relationship evolved in ways that surprised people who only knew the 2 men as bitter title rivals from the headlines. Lauda took the younger driver under his wing in small, practical ways, teaching him, by his own account, how to separate the frustration of a bad result from the rest of his life. Prost has spoken since about that mentorship with genuine warmth, describing Lauda as the old master to his eager young student, the idol of his youth going back to his earliest years in karting. Lauda, for his part, rarely spoke about mentoring anyone. His praise for Prost came out sideways, in the form of respect earned through combat. That respect never faded with distance. Decades after both men had left the cockpit, Lauda continued to speak about the 1984 season as the high point of his rivalry-turned-friendship history, a year in which 2 of the most technically meticulous drivers the sport had ever produced happened to occupy the same garage at the same time and pushed each other to the very edge of what either was capable of. When Lauda eventually joined Mercedes as non-executive chairman decades later, he brought the same standard with him, judging every driver who came after Prost implicitly against the benchmark of precision that his old McLaren teammate had first shown him was possible. What Prost represented to Lauda in the end wasn't simply a rival he happened to beat by half a point in one of the closest championships ever contested. It was proof that Lauda's own calculating approach to racing was a legitimate path to greatness that another driver, arriving from a completely different background, had independently discovered for himself. 2 computers briefly sharing a garage, each recognizing something of themselves in the other, and neither willing to admit it easily until long after the stopwatches had stopped. It had been Prost in that McLaren garage back in 1984, half a point separating 2 men who had spent an entire long season refusing to give the other anything at all for free. 4. James Hunt. Niki Lauda and James Hunt met racing in Formula 3 long before either had won anything of consequence, and the friendship that formed in those early years survived everything that came after, including a world championship fight so ferocious it was eventually turned into a Hollywood film.
James won in that particular year the championship. I was happy it was him and not somebody else, if I couldn't do it.
The 2 men could not have been more different. Lauda was methodical, calculating, obsessive about preparation to the point of coldness. Hunt was a showman, chaotic off the track and thrillingly instinctive on it. The kind of driver who seemed to win as much through sheer bravado as through technique. Lauda later called him, without qualification, the most charismatic personality who had ever been in Formula One. The 1976 season pushed that friendship to its absolute limit. Lauda's horrific crash at the Nürburgring left him disfigured and, according to doctors at the time, close to death. Yet he returned to the cockpit just 6 weeks later, racing at Monza with wounds still visibly unhealed. Hunt clawed back the points deficit that followed, and the title came down to a rain-soaked final round in Japan, where Lauda, still recovering, made the decision to withdraw rather than risk his life further, handing Hunt the championship by a single point. It would have been easy for Lauda to resent that outcome for the rest of his life. He did the opposite. Lauda has said plainly that if anyone other than himself was going to win that championship, he was glad it was Hunt, a remarkable admission from a driver who had nearly died chasing the same title. He described their relationship in terms rarely used between title rivals. Not quite best friends, he said, but simpatico. Two men who looked out for each other in a sport that, in that era, rarely offered any such courtesy between competitors. Hunt, for his part, said he felt Lauda deserved to win the championship as much as he did, and wished, decades later, that the two of them could somehow have shared it. What Lauda respected most about Hunt wasn't only his talent behind the wheel, considerable as it was. It was the fact that Hunt represented everything Lauda himself was not. Reckless where Lauda was calculating, spontaneous where Lauda was rigid, and yet somehow arrived at the same level of excellence through a completely opposite process. Lauda later reflected that a wise man gets more from his enemies than a fool gets from his friends, a philosophy he applied directly to his years racing against Hunt, treating the rivalry itself as an education rather than simply an obstacle standing between him and a championship. When Hunt died suddenly of a heart attack in 1993, at just 45, Lauda's grief carried a particular weight. He said he wasn't surprised by the loss, only sad, describing Hunt as one of the very few people in the sport he had genuinely liked, and fewer still that he had respected. He went further, admitting that Hunt remained the only person he had ever truly envied, a striking confession from a three-time world champion who had, by any conventional measure, achieved more in the sport than Hunt ever did. Lauda wished publicly that his old rival could have lived to see Rush. What Hunt gave Lauda in the end wasn't a lesson in technique. It was proof that greatness in Formula One didn't require Lauda's own painstaking, joyless discipline, that a driver could win at the very highest level while seemingly enjoying every second of it. Lauda never adopted that approach himself, but he spent the rest of his life speaking about the man who embodied it with something closer to love than rivalry ever usually allows. That admission mattered because Lauda so rarely allowed himself sentiment about anyone in the sport, treating even his own championships with a kind of detached satisfaction rather than joy. Hunt was the one relationship Lauda never tried to rationalize into a formula, the one rival he simply let himself miss. 3. Michael Schumacher. Niki Lauda and Michael Schumacher never raced against each other. Lauda's career ended in 1985, 6 years before Schumacher's Formula One debut, but few relationships in the sport's history were as consequential to Schumacher's rise as the one Lauda quietly built with him from the boardroom rather than the cockpit. When Luca di Montesemolo took control of Ferrari in 1991 and asked Lauda to come on as a consultant, one of Lauda's first moves was recommending Jean Todt to lead the racing team, over the objections of executives who wanted an Italian in the role. It was Todt who would go on to sign Schumacher and build the operation around him that delivered 5 consecutive world championships. Lauda's fingerprints were on that transformation before Schumacher had won a single race for the team. Lauda's public support for Schumacher was consistent and occasionally fierce. During a difficult stretch in the mid-2000s, when Ferrari's press turned on Schumacher over strategy failures and questioned whether the 7-time champion had lost his edge, Lauda leapt to his defense publicly, arguing that Ferrari was wasting an irreplaceable resource by leaving Schumacher's advisory role ambiguous. He insisted there was no one better suited to sit on the pit wall making real-time decisions, someone whose experience alone made him worth 100 engineers. It was a rare and pointed public endorsement from a man not known for handing out praise casually. That respect, though, never curdled into uncritical loyalty. When Schumacher announced his comeback with Mercedes in 2010, Lauda, who had staged his own famous return to the cockpit decades earlier, was initially supportive, drawing on his own experience to explain the psychological pull of unfinished business. But as the comeback faltered across 3 uncompetitive seasons, Lauda didn't hesitate to say so publicly, urging Schumacher to be honest with himself about whether the results, or the hunger for them, were really still there. It was the kind of blunt assessment Lauda delivered to everyone in the sport, unfiltered by history. Schumacher, for his part, didn't always take the criticism well. At one particularly heated moment, he lashed out at Lauda publicly, suggesting that his former Ferrari mentor had lost the ability to see clearly why things were going wrong at the team he had helped build. It was a rare public rupture between 2 men who had otherwise spent nearly 2 decades on largely the same side of Formula One's biggest questions. What made the relationship endure despite that friction was something deeper than any single disagreement about strategy or timing. Lauda saw in Schumacher a driver operating with the same relentless, almost joyless application to craft that had defined his own career. A man who treated every session, every test, every marginal gain as worth chasing, regardless of how it looked from the outside. When Schumacher's skiing accident left his condition uncertain in the years that followed, Lauda spoke about him with none of the bluntness that had characterized their public disagreements, only quiet concern. Lauda never called Schumacher the greatest driver he ever saw outright, reserving that particular judgment for someone else entirely. But in nearly every practical sense, in the decisions he made to build the team around him, in the public defenses he mounted on his behalf, and in the honest criticism he never withheld, Lauda treated Schumacher's career as one worth investing his own reputation in, again and again. It was a strange tribute, delivered through actions, a hiring recommendation, a public defense, a blunt criticism exactly when needed most, spread quietly across 3 decades of a career he never once shared a grid with. 2. Ayrton Senna. On May 1st, 1994, the day Ayrton Senna died at Imola, journalists around the world scrambled to reach the sport's most respected voices for reaction. Niki Lauda, never a man to soften his opinions for the sake of the moment, gave one of the starkest. Senna, he said, was the greatest driver who had ever lived. And when someone like him is killed, you have to ask yourself what the point of any of it really is. It wasn't a eulogy crafted for effect. It was the blunt, unmistakably Lauda assessment of a man who had spent his own career being famous for exactly that kind of unsentimental honesty, delivered on the single worst day in the sport's recent history. Lauda and Senna raced against each other only briefly, their careers overlapping mainly in Senna's early McLaren years, while Lauda was finishing his own second championship-winning comeback in 1984 and 1985. But brief overlap was enough for Lauda to form an assessment he never significantly revised over the following decade. He described Senna as the best and most charismatic driver Formula One had ever produced, an unbelievable character who combined personality, speed, and charisma in a combination Lauda felt certain explained why Senna had won virtually everything there was to win. What set Senna apart from the other elite drivers of Lauda's own era wasn't just outright pace, which several of his rivals also possessed at a world-class level. It was something closer to totality, the sense that Senna had no discernible weakness anywhere in his game. Where Lauda had built his own reputation on calculation, he recognized in Senna something he considered rarer still, a driver whose instinct and calculation operated simultaneously at the very top of both scales, rather than one compensating for a deficiency in the other. Lauda's regard for Senna extended into how he thought about the sport's evolution more broadly. Decades later, when journalists periodically polled experts, engineers, and former drivers on the greatest of all time, Lauda's answer remained essentially unchanged from the one he had given on the day of Senna's death, a level of consistency rare for a man whose opinions on almost everything else in Formula One shifted with new evidence and new eras. Senna, for Lauda, wasn't simply the best driver of his own generation. He was the benchmark against which every subsequent contender for the title of greatest ever was silently measured. There was something almost stubborn about that loyalty to a single judgment. Formula One spent the following decades producing driver after driver anointed as the next great contender for the title Senna had held since 1994. And Lauda watched most of that parade unfold from close range, first as a television analyst, and later from inside a championship-winning team he himself helped rebuild from nearly nothing at all. He entertained every fresh comparison when it was raised in front of him, weighed each one honestly, and then, more often than not, returned quietly to the same conclusion he had reached in the raw grief of that Sunday afternoon at Imola, that whatever the sport produced afterward, it had already seen its most complete driver. 1. Lewis Hamilton. In the autumn of 2012, Niki Lauda made a phone call that would reshape the final years of his life, almost as much as it reshaped Formula One. Mercedes had won a single race in 3 seasons since returning to the sport as a full works team, and Lauda, newly installed as the team's non-executive chairman, was convinced the missing piece wasn't the car, it was the driver. He set his sights on Lewis Hamilton, then still under contract at McLaren, and made the case directly in a car that wasn't yet competitive. Hamilton told him his life was easy. Lauda's counter was simple. If Schumacher couldn't get Mercedes running at the front across 3 years, and Hamilton could do it the following season, people would rate him higher than they ever had before. Hamilton signed. What Lauda saw in Hamilton before that deal was struck was, by his own account, unambiguous. Even while Hamilton was still driving an uncompetitive car in his final McLaren seasons, Lauda called him the best driver in the world, someone unbelievably quick who made no compromises, regardless of what the machinery beneath him was capable of. It was a rare and specific form of praise, not that Hamilton was fast in a good car, but that his speed remained undiminished even when the car gave him every reason to ease off. That quality was what convinced Lauda he was worth the risk. The gamble paid off almost immediately, and the years that followed cemented a bond between the two men that went well beyond the usual relationship between a driver and a team chairman. Lauda became something closer to a mentor and a friend, a blunt, plain-spoken presence in Hamilton's corner through 6 world championships won in Mercedes colors, someone who understood, better than almost anyone else in the paddock, exactly what it took to sustain excellence at the very top of the sport across a long career. Hamilton has spoken since about how much of that early Mercedes success traced back to a chairman willing to bet his own credibility on him. Lauda's death in May 2019 arrived in the middle of that championship run, and the loss reshaped how Hamilton spoke about the sport for years afterward. Toto Wolff described Mercedes as having lost not just a chairman, but the heart and soul of Formula One itself, a sentiment Hamilton echoed in his own tributes, crediting Lauda directly with believing in him at a moment when few others in the sport were making the same bet. Every championship Hamilton won afterward carried some trace of that original phone call. Of everyone Lauda ever raced against, worked alongside, or recruited across 5 decades in Formula One, Hamilton was the only one whose greatest achievements Lauda helped engineer directly rather than simply witnessed from a distance. Wolff said that after Lauda's passing, Hamilton was among those hit hardest, not because he lost a colleague, but because the voice that had first told him, bluntly and without flattery, that he was the best driver in the world had gone quiet for good. Lauda never handed out admiration lightly, and these 5 earned it through 5 different currencies: a championship lost by half a point, a friendship that outlasted a fatal rivalry, a career built from the boardroom, a judgment never revised after the worst day of his life, and a phone call that gambled his own name on a driver still unproven. Subscribe for more F1 history worth knowing.